Now, the conference this year focuses on foundational renewal. And as we know, COVID-19 has severely impacted economies around the globe and exposed the fragility of our foundational reliance systems. This adds to pre-existing crises, and to confront these challenges, the foundational economy requires a substantial renewal driven by new ways of thinking and collaborative action. And we hope this conference will contribute to this renewal through dialogue between researchers, practitioners and policymakers. You can find out more about WISERD Foundational Economy Research Networks and the Foundational Economy work on the WISERD website and the Foundational Economy website. Now, as I said, the aim of the 3 days is to bring researchers, practitioners and policymakers together to reflect on fundamental questions such as how the foundational economy contributes to a good life for everyone, and discuss the achievements and challenges of concrete projects such as place-based social experiments. And our first session this morning focuses on what makes a good life. So I'm particularly pleased to introduce our keynote speaker and two discussants this morning who have taken ideas and applied them in different settings to improve people's lives. Our discussants will be Charlotte Carpenter, who's Executive Director of Growth and Business Development at Carbon Homes, and Chris Yones, who is Chief Executive of Building Communities Trust. Now, I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Hilary Cottam OBE. Hilary is Honorary Professor at the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL, and she is a trustee of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Her book, Radical Help, I highly recommend. It's a tour de force full of innovative examples that rethink the provision of welfare. Her current programme of work revolves around the theme of Social Revolution 5.0, and she has published a manifesto addressing how we can make that happen. And she is currently exploring what good work might look like in this century, a very important topic for WISERD researchers, I know. So I think she is the ideal person to kick us off today with her talk on the good working life. Over to you, Hilary.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So I was really delighted to be asked to join you this morning and to kind of join this community, which I think there's so much exploration about how we can really build different economies, and the work you do is so exciting. And so I'm very honoured to be with you to talk about work which is very sort of early and exploratory work for me. So as Ian mentioned, I mean, most of my working life has been on issues of welfare, and I work with communities building alternative forms of welfare that I think can better meet the challenges of this century. But when I took time to write the book Radical Help, it really dawned on me, I mean, something quite obvious dawned on me, which I'm sure because of the work you all do, you're thinking about much more, but that was just that the sort of economy and society has become so out of kilter, and many of us with sort of social concerns have focused on the social dimension at a point where really there's no economy left to underpin that social dimension. So of course, when Beveridge invented the welfare state, he had this idea that people had fundamentally good work which could support them, and when trouble came along that they might need some form of welfare and other support. But of course that kind of balance has completely changed. And so I wanted to kind of think about how we could look differently at work and the role that work plays within our lives. So I'm not talking about jobs, I'm talking about good lives in which work plays a particular role. And I received funding from the Soros Foundation to start some explorations in communities in Britain, and that's what I'm going to kind of share with you this morning. So as I say, this is very early work. I started it in 2020 and it came to a bit of a halt, of course, when I could no longer travel around. I'm about to go to Grimsby and continue the work. But I had to kind of pause it in the pandemic. And basically, I start by asking people to come together and to draw their working lives. Now, for some reason, I can't make my slides move. There we go. And it's a really simple exercise. The idea is to kind of bring people into the room and make them feel comfortable. And I give them this sheet of paper, which has got sort of one axis, which is 0 to 100, the idea that you might live to 100 or more, and on another, a sort of positive and negative. And with coloured pens, I ask people to kind of design the all aspects of their lives, their kind of working lives, their relational lives, and so on. And everybody draws these extremely kind of zigzaggy lines. Participants in my workshop come from all walks of life. I've been working with carers, nurses, gravediggers, nuclear weapon makers, university professors, digital entrepreneurs, mechanics, people starting again after perhaps a life of addiction. So people from every walk of life. And it's really noticeable that for everybody, the story is the same. They draw these kind of really deep ups and downs. They document the highs and lows of jobs lost, promotions gained, perhaps the birth of a child, a divorce, a death, a second chance, a move, a new qualification, friendships. Everything is on these graphs that people kind of draw in this very open way. I was quite surprised. But as people draw and the sort of Sharpies squeak over the page, really what most people talk about is this endless juggle. And something much deeper, which is this very pervasive sense of instability. So from the early career academics who were actually on strike at the time that I ran those workshops, to carers, to mechanics, everybody feels themselves to be standing on very unstable ground. And what I think is very striking is that these lives, our lives, I don't think they're the ones that policymakers imagine when they draw up social reforms and economic strategies. So I think we still have at a policy level this mindset of stability, Pareto optimality, a steady state. And so we still kind of try to design interventions that return us to this kind of imagined balance that I talked about in the beginning when Beveridge designed the welfare state. So that idea, I call it the 1950s mindset, was that people's lives are more or less stable, something might happen, you can return them to that kind of flat line and you can carry on. And that is still the kind of mindset of the policymaker. But actually, the modern mindset, and the mindset that all my participants in the workshops have exhibited, is this understanding that equilibrium is fleeting at most, and we need to think of a completely different reality and how we design for that reality. So then what happened was that when the pandemic engulfed us 2 months later, this unease, which everybody talked about in my workshops, no matter their walk of life, but which has been, I think, very largely misunderstood and brushed aside by policymakers, and became suddenly the concern of elites. And so we had headlines like this in the Financial Times: virus lays bare the frailty of the social contract, and the Financial Times editorial pieces, which have continued to do this, and others, beginning to argue for more active government, a recategorization of welfare as a public service, an investment rather than a liability, and so on. But as I said at the beginning, my inquiry isn't really about work or jobs, it's about good working lives. And I'm asking this question about what makes a good working life, which is a question about work, but also about care, about play, about family, friendships. It's about values, deeper perceptions about what matters. Of course, it's also about income and material means, feelings. And also, I think very importantly, it's a question about the organisation of work and work organisations themselves. So the work that I'm doing is community rooted and the exploration is collective. So of course, as I said, this means that my inquiry had to be halted when I could no longer do collective work. And I'm sharing something that's very early, but I'm very excited to do that because I know that the next phase will be enriched by our conversation today and being able to meet with all of you, which is really wonderful. So the context for my work is this belief that I know is shared by probably most people here, which is that we're living through this paradigm shift, this great transition. But there is this idea of the great transition, the technology revolution, looming ecological catastrophe, and the kind of legacy challenges of deep injustice. So anyways, I say that we have these kind of three sides of the transition as I see it, which is the climate challenge, technology challenge, and then this idea that we've got deep legacies of injustice, which haven't been resolved by the kind of social and economic systems we have, and are forcing us to ask really big questions about how we live and what we value. And I suppose the underpinning idea in my work is that this provides us with a very big opportunity, because the history of technology revolutions in particular shows that with each revolution, work changes in scope and pattern, and different groups of people benefit. So the work of Carlotta Perez, the economist Carlotta Perez, who says that we're in the fifth technology revolution, which is why I talk about social revolution 5.0, shows that in each technology revolution, different groups of people are drawn into a better life. And of course, other groups of people suffer. So I think very much in this revolution, we're asking about how we can really kind of think about gains and new lives in a different, more holistic, wider way. But what's really important is that these changes aren't a given. They have to be made and they have to be fought for. And I think, first of all, they have to be imagined. We have to be able to think about what a better settlement might look like, particularly around work, in order to argue for it and achieve it. So I'm really deeply interested in how we can collectively draw on the imaginations and think about that. Because I think that, of course, lots and lots of people now are talking about work. It's become very fashionable to talk about the future of work. But it strikes me that the conversation is very narrow, not least because it's just about jobs rather than kind of it's about jobs and skills, and still really how do you get on that sort of conveyor belt. But in particular, I think worker voices, you and me, are really notable by our absence. So the idea is that we need to widen our lens, and I have these two questions at the heart of my inquiry. So the first is, what would a good working life look like end to end? And the second is, what new forms of collaboration and organisation are needed to make this possible in practice? And so my work starts in the shoes of those who work, by which I mean any of us who have to actually exchange our time for money in some form, so we can't live off sort of gains, other kinds of financial gains. And I've divided workers into 4 categories, which you can see here, which is somewhat arbitrary. So I'm working with low pay minimum wage workers. I'm working with highly skilled workers, many of whom will have to make a transition if we're really going to have a green economy, which we don't talk about enough. The fact that very well paid skilled work, for instance, I've been working with nuclear workers at BAE, will become kind of questionable in new ways if we really are to have a green transition. I'm working with gig workers, and I'm working with a category that I call digital artisans, which is a term I've coined for a cohort that are predominantly young, usually graduates. They work in digitally based activities, either as self-employed or small startups. And I think what's really important about this category is it's a growing part of the economy, very dynamic, but doesn't kind of connect in most ways to kind of formal economic structures. So it's very difficult for often people who are digital artisans to get mortgages, to access loans for their work. And so their growth is limited. And I think we saw, how vulnerable this group can be to economic shocks because they're in the sort of Rishi Sunak 3 million excluded, for example. And so far I've worked in Barrow, in East Ayrshire, London. I'm going to work in other places. I'm going to be in Grimsby in a couple of weeks to start to continue the work. And so I work through 3 design dynamics with participants. The first I've shown you, which is I simply ask people to draw individually their working lives. The second, which I'm going to talk about now, is that I ask people to design a good working life. And then the third, which I'll come on to, I ask participants, I give them a blank sheet of paper, basically a paper tablecloth, and I ask them to design the organisation that would make this new form of work possible. So in the first exercise, the participants have to agree amongst themselves in groups of 4, what are the seeds of a good working life? And I give every group this wheel, which is divided in these 4 ways around money, purpose, relationships and capability. And I give every participant a group of playing cards, and there are also some blank cards because obviously people want to put on things that I haven't kind of thought about. And so the group then have to decide, the paper is blank, and then they have to decide which cards to put on the paper. And of course, what's really important isn't the arrangement of cards, it's the discussion that happens in the groups as they decide and argue amongst them what's important and what's not important in life. Then all kinds of things come out. And I've written about this before. I find that when people are kind of looking at something and doing a dynamic, they talk about things which might be much too personal to talk about in a focus group or in some kind of interview situation. So for example, things that were considered in the work as important but unreachable in different ways weren't ranked. So a classic example is a pension. So, people said like, a pension. Then they just kind of put the card to one side. It's like, that's way too idealistic to think that I might have a pension. Other participants said, oh, those with kind of manual work or whatever, and particularly those in nuclear industries, oh, we die early, so we don't kind of need something like that. Other people in more playful moods sort of thought about things that they might like if they could live in an ideal world. So, people said, oh, I wish I could have a cleaner, even if it was just for one day. And then, of course, there were gender differentials. Women spent much more of their time thinking about caring roles and how care intersects with work, something I'm going to come on to, how that could be alternatively reimagined and refunded. Fathers with young children tended to prioritise this subject. There were age differentials. One thing that's very striking is that young people put way more cards on the table. They've got kind of much bigger ambition about all the things that could be in their good lives. Older people tend to be a little bit more like, oh, well, I'm not really sure kind of what's realistic and what I can expect. It's been really striking that some groups find imagining much harder than others. So in particular, when I've worked with workers within the NHS, I found it really difficult to kind of encourage them to think beyond their current reality. They don't expect trends to reverse for a better life. They don't expect a more realistic future possibility. And that's kind of very, you know, where kind of work and the realistic sort of the difficulties of working in a particular environment get kind of meshed with your sort of personal visions, which of course happens. And then the other thing that happens is that people exchange kind of life tips and life hacks. So there were lots of discussions, for example, around the tables in every place about how people save. And people found it all sorts of formal and informal ways, which obviously people don't normally talk about, and people found very interesting. And then they would have great conversations about kind of exchanging tips. So the work's been very rich, and I just want to kind of touch on 3 themes this morning. So the first is that instability, as I've said, is the norm. So I've touched on this pervasive sense that you don't know what life is going to throw at you, that, you know, you don't know if you're going to have a stable and predictable income, but also the lack of wider support. Almost nobody feels supported by current institutions, which they largely don't expect to last much longer, even the NHS. Changes are driven by personal relationships as much as by work. So, for example, the state of your marriage determining your well-being, the age of your children determining where you can work, how stressed you feel, similarly the age of your parents. And of course, there's nothing new in this, but I think it's really important that these things aren't factored into the way we work and how we kind of talk in an integral way about work. The other thing is that second chances are talked about a lot. So those who had been offered second chances in their 20s had often made dramatic turnarounds in their lives through retraining or a new relationship in some form. But the focus of the conversation was always about how second chances are so hard to come by because school and work are still organised in this very linear kind of 1950s production line way, which brings me to my second theme, which is around the non-linear life. So I've done my research in places where good work is hard to come by. And pretty much everybody I've worked with is kind of grateful if they've got a decent job. But this doesn't limit the demands for quite a radical rethink about time in particular. So, for instance, a gravedigger in Kilmarnock said to me, what we really need is the disruption of the linear life. These are his words. I don't want to work until I'm broken. I don't want to take the same 5 weeks of holiday a year without a chance to really travel or learn. I don't want to have to try and care for my family in the gaps in between. Why can't we just rethink it top to bottom? There was a universal demand for a 4-day working week, which isn't one of my cards. So people had to design them themselves. That was not a possibility that anybody could choose in the dynamic. And more than this, there were much richer conversations about how we can ensure there's time to think, to be outdoors. Nature was a strong theme everywhere. Can holidays be aggregated in different ways to learn, to change? And people with physically demanding jobs talked about ways that they wanted to kind of change along their working lives so they don't have this pattern where they have to kind of work and then retire feeling exhausted. It's important to have new ways to learn skills and to have an interesting life. The words interesting life cropped up a lot. So time, of course, is the law we're told we can't escape. It's like this metronome that ticks inside us even when we're asleep. And it's clear, I think, that the idea of good work and good working lives depend on disrupting these ideas of linear chronos time that underpinned the last industrial revolution. And in a way, it's ironic because we know that one of the hardest things the industrial bosses found in the earlier 20th century was actually to get their workers to think about time, which is why they kind of put up beautiful clocks in town squares. And of course, Henry Ford tied his new $5 wage to a perceived ability to keep organized time. And he had a team of 50 strong family investigators that went into people's homes and judged whether this was an organized family that could keep to time. And if it was, they could get the $5 wage. And it wasn't meant to be like this. Keynes predicted the 15-hour week in 1930. And at the same time, in the 1930s, this really radical experiment began in the factory of Kellogg's, the breakfast manufacturer. And so many of you might know this story. Kellogg offered his workers 6-hour shifts in the place of the normal 8-hour working day. So he offered them the same wage levels, but for only working 6 hours. And of course, it was an instant success. the company reaped dividends in forms of higher productivity, absenteeism went down, industrial accidents went down, and politicians, journalists, Hoover, researchers, everybody flocked to have a look at these new arrangements. And there have been some really interesting anthropological studies done of the workers, both at the time and later. And what's really interesting is that the workers didn't think this kind of rebirth of their freedom was anything particularly unusual. They kind of, a bit like Keynes, had expected technology to bring them shorter working days. And so they thought it was great, and they embraced it, and they spent their time running clubs, parenting, baking, caring, and actually making culture, which I think was also very important. They weren't consumers of culture. They began to use the time to make culture in kind of important and varied ways. And as I say, they thought it was kind of unremarkable that technology would deliver this for everybody, and that they would have these richer lives in every sense. But of course, actually the opposite has happened. And so far, the technology revolution has been used to intensify time everywhere, from the Amazon warehouse to the way the British police force operates, to the infamous 7/24/12 shift of the Chinese factory. And work, as the WHO is telling us, is killing us. And I'd also add, actually, really importantly, that where it doesn't kill us, it makes us, far too many of us, unbearably miserable. So our factory schools and our factory workplaces create this inexorable and still rising demand for mental health support. It's a way of working that's very expensive on this human level and also on a financial level. And again, we've got some really important modern day experiments that prove the case. So I'm thinking, for example, of the work of Karen Mattison and Emma Stewart, the founders of TimeWise. Again, I'm sure many of you know them. And their consultancy is built on this very simple premise that if you offer good part-time flexible work, you attract a talented, loyal, and highly motivated workforce. And I think it's not surprising that in the beginning, many of the TimeWise clients were mothers trying to balance kind of high professional skills with wanting to balance kind of time with their very small children. And they, they loved their professions, they wanted both. But TimeWise grew in the early years because employers realized that they were attracting much higher caliber candidates through offering predictable but flexible work. And more recently, the gender balance has evened out, because after all, fathers also want to care. Many of us want more flexibility and time with friends, and older workers as well kind of want time to care and so on. But TimeWise, I think, are really important pioneers because they've shown over almost 2 decades now in the UK that work and care can be integrated in a different way to show that business can be better. So care is the third and biggest theme of the work and the kind of findings that have come out so far. So I've said that right from the get-go, everybody starts to talk about the juggle of trying to manage the demands of paid work and unpaid care. And millions of us, of course, live lives of acute stress as we try to manage this border war, as I see it, the competing demands of caring for very small children, for friends who might need extra support, for young adults whose minds and bodies are seen somehow not to fit the economy, or for our parents as they age and become more frail. And of course, these demands for time to care aren't new. Anyone entering this debate stands on the shoulders of decades of feminist scholarship, the activism of disability movements, and more recently, environmentalists who've understood the ethical connections and are kind of persuading us to see that care for ourselves and care for wider living webs is all part of the same system. But I suppose in the work that I'm doing now, I'm asking, might this be the moment in which a technology revolution on the one hand is disrupting work and lots of things besides, and also that the structures of our care are so visibly torn that it is offering us kind of really a chance to reimagine and rework. And when I think about the last industrial revolution, the fourth revolution, the mass industrial revolution, and the workers that crowded into our cities, I think if you had said to them as they, first crowded in kind of really terrible conditions that, you're going to get decent incomes, paid holiday and a 2-day weekend, you'd have been really mocked. People have said, you're smoking crack, but it happened. And I want to suggest that the weekend, which was that totemic, if fragile gain of the early 20th century, needs to be echoed in this century in a really radical rethinking between the relationship between work and care. And in my workshops, there's been this demand that care time should be as normal as the weekend and should be reintegrated in a very different way with work. So the implications, of course, are that we revalue our time to care and to work, and we revalue care itself. And we think in particular about how we have transition incomes as part of the kind of great transition to kind of support people who are doing things that might be dirty in terms of the kind of green revolution that is to come, in a transition to kind of care in the very widest sense, in the kind of new economy that we want to build, by which I mean care and repair for ourselves and our wider systems. And the idea that this care work is well-paid vocational work. So it's not work that's going to be judged by the Chronos clock. It's going to be recognised for what it is, which is messy work of human and natural entanglement, much closer to art and craft, in fact, much closer to models of the third revolution than to models of the fourth revolution. And this is the foundation of the good working life that was kind of talked about at the tables as people sorted their cards. And I think it's the part of the urgent work that we have to do now to reimagine and to tell stories about what this might look like and how we can kind of integrate this work for caring for the planet, for one another, and this deep work of repair together. And of course, I suppose the most obvious thing is that we can only do this collectively. This isn't individual work. It can't be done by individual workers or businesses, which brings me to the third segment of my workshop, which is about collective work. So as I said in the third section, I put this white paper tablecloth on the table for each group. And I offer pens, paper, glue, scissors, magazines, all sorts of different magazines for inspiration. And I ask each small group to design the work organisation that they would like to belong to, the organisation that they feel might support good working lives. And I'm not sure if I've mentioned this, but for most of my participants, this kind of working is completely something new. And at this point, they start to really laugh and they're like, there's no way I'd have come if I knew I was going to have to do something like this. But basically people kind of, and I offer a coffee break and I'm like, oh, please come back, which luckily people always do. But everybody gets stuck in, and it's been really extraordinary. I mean, as I say, I've worked with people from very different backgrounds, very different places, and some really strong common themes have emerged from the designs that come out. So people begin to kind of draw on the table, they begin to kind of map out in different ways what they want. And so in all cases, the imagined organisation, and this is a free form exercise, is locally rooted and community based. In all cases, membership is broad. It's not based on skill or job, but everybody suggests it should be open to everyone, young, old, in work, out of work, beyond work. In quotes, a union that recognises your whole life, and just as importantly, can link you to others with different skills and perhaps new openings and possibilities. Lots of participants, you might see this in images that come of kind of libraries of skills, but lots of participants talk about borrowing knowledge from one another and the importance of having somebody in your community that will vouch for you, in a kind of clear recognition that in the modern economy, relationships and testimonials matter above everything else in getting good and stable work. So here are just, you can see the library on the right there, but here are just some things that, these are just parts of the tablecloths that people have put together for me. Some of them are quite funny. I think kind of Harry and Meghan are going to kind of appear in one moment. So they're quite playful, but they're also very rich. And participants talk about the new organisations being defined by a kind ethos. And sometimes this kindness has been literally interpreted with designs that put health and well-being at the centre, like you can see in some of these images here. Sometimes kindness means being able to access practical support, from loans to childcare, without scrutiny or demeaning assessments, because this will be something that everybody is part of. And in every case, the kind organisation was depicted as one where people feel supported in the very broadest way. So it's like a club with a warm sense of welcome and belonging, a place where you can be yourself, where somebody greets you, you hang up your coat. I mean, people talked in quite detailed ways about this. This strong sense that new forms of practical support are required to stress less and live your life, and to feel that things are under control. So this support, which was detailed as advice, loans, childcare, trusted help with how to go about finding that second chance that people talked about in the second dynamic, when things go wrong or when you just want to kind of think again, was part of every organisational design. As was a discussion about how this help would be provided in a democratic and peer-led way. So lots of people talked about what they had to offer the organisation, which was really interesting. So people talked very kind of dynamically about what they would bring and what they would kind of want to take. They also drew on lots of very different sorts of organisations that they're part of, which make them feel kind of welcomed and part of something, whether it's a kind of sports club or a kind of members club, and contrasted it with other forms of often state support, actually, where they're not made to feel kind of a peer and welcome. So the imagined organisation would also focus on pay and conditions, but in new ways. So there were discussions about how to negotiate this 4-day working week, but also much broader discussions that took into account the shifting patterns of work, which mean you need different forms of saving, this new way of vouching, which I talked about, new forms of expertise and advice. People talked about borrowing knowledge like a library, taking it out, trying it out, borrowing jobs, sending them back if you don't like them, or continuing in them. And so the discussions are also quite aspirational, lots of drawings, I think we saw, of ladders of experience. There were very high levels of disillusionment with existing unions. So in Barrow and East Ayrshire, 50% of my participants were members of existing trades unions, which of course is quite high. In London, the academics were, and they were on strike, but other people I've worked with have not been part of unions. But there were lots of critiques. They just send me lots of marketing material, buy this, buy that, people said. And then a couple of individuals, I've had a couple of occasions where individuals who are kind of perhaps have a role in organising in unions, then take the opportunity to try to explain to everybody else at their table, you know, what collective bargaining is, why it really matters. Usually, you know, other people at the table, they're just not interested. They just try to kind of keep the dynamic going. It's quite interesting. I mean, working in Barrow, of course, was a different dynamic. People in Barrow definitely see the importance of a national union to lobby government to kind of keep the nuclear option on the table. But broadly, apart from that, and even in Barrow, actually, which is something we could talk about, there's this idea that unions bring up traditional concerns, but they're not the ones that bother us right now. And there was a very widespread shared cultural distaste for the adversarial nature of industrial trades unions. I want you all to know that I'm a member of a trades union. This is not a kind of, you know, this is not about problems with unions. This is just what emerged at the tables. But when we look at the history of technology revolutions, the thinking around paradigm shifts in which my research is located, we can see, I think, very clearly that with every technology revolution, there is a profound change in the pattern of work organising. So in the last mass industrial revolution, people didn't expect that guilds any longer would be able to kind of support them and advocate for the changes that they needed facing kind of industrial bosses. And so we had the growth of the mass industrial union, and the guilds withered. And so I think it's an open question as to what form, whether this will be a new form of existing industrial trades union that is radically reorganised, or whether something very different emerges. Because I think the other thing that we see when we look at kind of the history of work organisation is that things that are discarded in one industrial revolution often come back, you know, several hundred years later in a very kind of new but important form. And I think the renewed interest and energy around cooperatives at the moment is really, really a good example of how things kind of might sort of not die a death. Cooperatives have always been important and with us, but there's a kind of renewed energy around them. So sometimes things come back with this energy, sometimes things are lost, and it's not clear, I think, at the moment what's going to happen. I think there is this very big question about whether industrial trades unions can adapt, or whether we have to invent something new, and whether the place-based organisations that have been imagined in my workshops that address these very modern concerns from care to new forms of learning, surveillance and so on, are part of what might emerge and part of what we need to tell stories about. As part of my work, I am looking, I mean, there's sort of 3 strands, and this morning I'm just kind of focusing on what's come out of the work with workers. But as part of my work, I am looking at innovation within the union movement in the UK, in the US and in Europe. And I'm looking for examples. I've got lots, but if people here today, you can find me on my website, and it would be amazing. I would love to hear from people who've got things that they can share with me. In Britain, one of the most interesting experiments I know was the work of Unite Community and their organising in Shirebrook in 2005. And so I'm sure, again, some of you, maybe many of you know this work, which addressed the dilemma unions traditionally have when they leave a place, when the work's gone, you know, the industry moves out, the unions leave, but of course the workers are still there. And here Unite went back into the former mining community with the intention of changing conditions in the Sports Direct warehouse. And there were lots of local tensions because most of the people who had work in the Sports Direct warehouse weren't actually former miners, but Polish workers who were brought in through very complex international work agency arrangements, which meant that all the recruitment was managed outside Shirebrook. So one of the first things Unite Community did was work across the community in innovative ways to begin to bring together people with very different identities and heritages who are now living there, including a very strong focus and a kind of big reaching out of teaching English as a foreign language. And it was a very successful campaign. It shamed Sports Direct into new terms of work and the share price plummeted. I don't know if you kind of all remember the story. Something else I think that's been really interesting, but not sadly not so successful, but has been the kind of recent strike of British Gas. I think following this on social media, one of the things that was so interesting and relates kind of strongly to the work that I've been doing was that British Gas workers made an appeal about their human lives, you know, about the fact that they were dads, and they posted their children, and they wanted people to understand that kind of they wanted good working lives, which meant that they wanted time to parent, time to be with their partner, and they wanted to see this kind of, you know, terrible new contract that were being offered, not just in material terms, but in terms of a kind of good working life. And I think it was a really interesting campaign. And of course, then there's been experimentation with digital tools. I think the work of the co-worker movement in the US is very interesting. And Michelle Miller and her co-founder came out of the traditional union movement because they were frustrated with their inability to innovate, and in particular to kind of really trust in new ways workers' voice. So they created this organising platform that is targeted at large corporations, which is giving everyone from flight attendants to baristas the tools for organising. And the result has been some really successful gains with big places such as McDonald's, and a kind of explosion in activity in the pandemic. I mean, they've had to kind of really re-gear in the pandemic because people wanted their tools and started organising in really important ways. And then there were lots of kind of smaller experiments away under, you know, sort of putting portable, so how we can have portable benefits. And then something that, you know, as I've said, people that I've worked with are very concerned about, how can we use technology to share reputations as we move from place to place. And then in Europe and the US, there have been some very successful experiments in freelance organising, where health insurance has been used as a subsidy to form organisations that can protect workers and lobby for better conditions. So in France, some of you might know WeMind, founded by the very inspirational Hind El Idrissi. And I think it's really incredible what she's done, and she's built this very big community. And then of course in the US is the work of Sarah Horowitz and the Freelancers Union. But here in the UK, how to fund new forms of work organisation and how to fund these visions, you know, and Ian introduces saying this is practical work, and you know, my work is practical, I like to make it happen. It's a very big question because of course, fortunately, we don't have health insurance, we have the NHS, so we can't use those kinds of subscriptions. And in my workshops, there was a lot of discussion about how new organisations would be run and funded, and lots of models discussed by different groups, like could they be the providers of broadband, energy, also some form of worker contribution. But this very strong thread that it must feel owned and democratic, so that had to be self-funded and run in some way. So I think the kind of big question that emerges from my work is this: it's what would it take to actually capitalise the kinds of local organisations that were imagined in my workshop? And just as we understand that local economies need local infrastructure, lots of the things that the work of Carol and the foundational economy have been arguing for a long time, local development banks, different forms of professional networks and so on, I think that thriving economies and communities need the same. So capitalising places through new mutual structures, like those designed on the paper tablecloths in my workshops, would underpin this radical shift in relationship between capital and labour, economy and society, and state and community. And I think it's part of this bigger conversation that we need to have about capitalising local places. So finally, as I said at the outset, this is very early, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have now. But in closing, I just wanted to kind of draw out 5 things perhaps that we could talk about, or just that kind of, you know, are overarching themes that I'm seeing in my work. So the first is that the economy needs reshaping. I mean, obviously this is all of your work, and you've been kind of path leaders in this idea that exogenous and endogenous factors, including the technology revolution, climate crisis and so on, mean that we've got to be able to design economies that advance the richness of life rather than the richness of the economy itself. And this is leading to this revolution in economic thinking about regeneration rather than extraction, a focus on place, which the foundation economy work has been so core to. And everywhere I work, there is a kind of local ferment about these ideas that are kind of having different names and labels, but are kind of pointing in this direction. You know, what is good work for? What is the purpose at its heart? And how does it fit into this kind of new form of economy we want to build? The second is the challenge of transition. So as I've said, existing systems, services, mindsets, they're based on this linear model with traditional, predictable transitions. You go to school, you train, you work, you progress, you retire, and that world is gone. But we all know that, and yet our social support systems and our financial architecture is still exactly as if that was all there. And so I think we need a kind of very different social architecture that integrates with new working lives, which is what sort of my work and radical health is about. But I also think we need a fundamental rethink around transition, so that time out of work is this opportunity to retrain and care. But then we need something like a transition income that is kind of at a decent level, that enables people to move from one kind of industrial model to another, from one stage of life to another, and so on. The third theme is this search for meaning, that good work is about more than income, and that existing notions of good work are too narrow. They're shaped predominantly by men in the global north, and they are still modelled on this kind of idea of homo economicus, that cog in the industrial wheel, that we should ruthlessly focus on self-maximization. And we know there's this growing mismatch between how individuals see themselves, particularly Gen Z, and the demands of employers and managers. And, you know, I think it's really interesting that, you know, in corporations, I've got this other side of work. The third strand is with kind of industrial leaders themselves, and working with HR. I mean, this is still kind of an idea that was forged in the 90s, you know, that thinks ultimately mechanistically in terms of cogs, how to find people, train people, identify sectors where the cogs might be needed, and so on. And there's this growing gap between individuals and organizational form that was brilliantly summarized about a decade ago in the work of Frederic Laloux and his book Rethinking Organizations, where he shows the connections between the growing malaise within traditional organizations, talent shortage, productivity gaps, and declining mental health. Obviously, Kellogg's in the 1930s understood how to kind of turn that equation around. And in my own work, I've developed the concept of sapiens integra. So this is the kind of model that I think we need to use when we're kind of making policy, in contrast to the dastardly homo economicus. So sapia integra works, she loves, she plays, she creates for pleasure. She understands deeply that we become who we are and we thrive through our relationships with one another, with nature, and that we're driven by very complex emotions and drives, much more complex than current analytical and policy frameworks allow for. So I think to redesign work really means to draw on a new underlying understanding of what it is to be human and to flourish and to connect the two. So fourthly is this strand that I was talking about work organisations being in decline and out of touch. So we know that the trade union movement played this absolutely critical role in ensuring good work in the last revolution, limiting hours, child labour, wages, and so on. But today, despite the fact there's been an uptick in union membership during the pandemic, actually very few of us belong to any form of work organisation. And trade unions, which are vertically organised around particular forms of work, are struggling to cope, and they are looking for kind of dynamic, you know, as I've said, there's very interesting work going on within unions to look for new ways of working. But their adversarial culture also makes it very hard for them to play a role in current transitions. And I think looking again at previous transitions, we know that we do need new alliances. It's a very strong theme. So unions play a really critical role, but we have to have different interrelationships between a group I call the new industrialists, who are business leaders that also realise that the economy has to change. Those I call the organic intellectuals, because I want to reach beyond academia. I think anybody who's able to tell a big story now about what we can imagine and can touch hearts and minds is really important. The state, which of course has to play the kind of architectural role, but is currently struggling itself with industrial modes of operating, and then civil society, of which organised labour is critical. So everybody needs to contribute and play a role in new ways. And I think, you know, given the capitalisation I'm proposing, what's important is the deal we have for workers and what shape would that side of the organisation take. And then fifthly, I think sort of almost a circle back to where I started to close, I think it's really important to create space for new worker-led imaginings. So a lot of people, as I said, are thinking about the future of work, but I have been really struck that so much current innovation tends to focus on improving particular jobs or sectors. So how can we get more women into this sector, or how can we kind of regulate that sector? And I think this emphasis isn't surprising. And of course, it's important because we've seen gains that were won in the 20th century being eroded in this century. But I also think that ultimately, to really make the gains that we dream of and those who've been sitting around my tables dream of, we have to kind of have very different conversations and very new alliances. And so I'd like to come away from my work arguing that we need a social positioning of work. In other words, we need to remember that work, its meaning, its day-to-day activities, where it's located, all is about relationships and connections in that place, and that we have to begin to reimagine good working lives from there as an integral part of good economies. So thank you. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and thank you again for inviting me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hilary. That was wonderful, brilliant start to the conference, and so many issues from the kind of methods that you'd used, your preliminary findings, and the ideas for taking that forward. And it was really stimulating. So thank you so much. If you can hear me, can I take kind of the privilege of the chair just to say WISERD is doing work on union density and the reasons for variations in union density across the UK. And we're also doing work with garment workers in India, looking at the way that they are organising, sometimes outside union structures, and also working with women in the South Wales valleys who are dealing with that that kind of space between informal care and formal care work, which you so eloquently described. So maybe after this conference is over, it'd be really good to talk to you, to pick up on some of those issues and put you in touch with people who know a lot more than I do about that. But as chair, I've spoken too much now, and I'm delighted that we've got two discussants first. So our first discussant is Charlotte Carpenter, who's Executive Director of Growth and Business Development at Carbon Homes. Charlotte, if you're there, do you have some comments and questions?
Yes, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you very much, Hilary. That was really, really fascinating and very thought-provoking for me, but also in some ways very reaffirming, because I could see a lot of parallels between the conversations and the work that you're doing and what we're doing and thinking about at Carbon. So for those of you that are not familiar with Carbon Homes, which I suspect is most of you, we're a social housing provider. We operate mainly in the North East and Yorkshire, and we own and manage around 30,000 homes. Some of those are in quite affluent areas like York, but some of them are also in sort of very different areas. And one place in particular is Stanley in County Durham. That's basically an ex-mining community. Carbon Homes, sort of our underlying mission is to create a strong foundation for life. And that meant that we really have been thinking about, I suppose, a lot of the themes that Hilary, you've been talking about in terms of what makes a good life and what makes a good job or working life, and that we've been thinking about, well, what makes a good home and how does a good home and house contribute to a good life, but also we've been sort of strongly rooted in the whole person, and in particular for us and our customers, how does home and work and a good home and a good job intersect with each other, or fail to intersect with each other, and then the ramifications of that. And it was really for us at Carbon, it was thinking about all of these issues in places like Stanley, where we could see that a traditional approach to economic development and a theory that a focus on GVA and GDP would eventually trickle down to those areas and help the people that live there. We could see on the ground that that didn't work, but we could also see on the ground that a lot of the interventions that housing associations or other social actors were playing weren't really sort of having traction either. And I think that the reason for that was, as you've just said just now, there was no economy to underpin the social dimension to society, and that was basically what we see on the front line in housing. I think it's thinking about all of this that led us to start thinking about the foundational economy. And what I'm not sure about, Hilary, is whether or not you've consciously started, as we did at Carpenter, with thinking about the foundational economy, or whether or not your work and your themes happen to align with those of the foundational economy. So what I've heard from you is something that is strongly embracing of the foundational economy principles. So asset-based, focused on capability rather than what doesn't work. Very strongly consciously experimental work and learning from experiment as you go. Very strong bottom-up element to it, very strongly human-centric and a participatory approach, and something that very much puts the whole human at the heart. And then in taking forward your approach, I've also seen a number of sort of themes that would parallel with those that cropped up with us when we've been thinking about a foundational economy approach to place and housing. So one area that has come out particularly strongly for me is your theme around stability or lack of stability. So one of the things that you said earlier was that everyone feels themselves to be standing on very unstable ground, and we know that's very much something that our own customers experience, and COVID took that unstable ground totally away from them. And I think that you also have talked about there's not a linear life, which I think is particularly problematic, is if, as what you say, there are no second chances, because it means that if things go wrong, which for our customers, our tenants, they often do for one reason or another, there's almost no route back onto the sort of the treadmill or back into society in a way that would enable you to live a fulfilling or economic or a sort of socially or spiritually productive life. And I think that given that, it's unsurprising that you found that, again, to quote you, people found it really difficult to think beyond their current reality. And again, that's something that we find in housing. So housing associations will often get quite high customer satisfaction scores. And, I'd like to think that part of the reason for that is because by and large, we do a good job. But actually, I think that one of the reasons for that is because we've got a customer set who've got really low life expectations and experiences, and find it very difficult to imagine beyond the immediate problem. A second theme that has come out very strongly for me in what you've said is one about care and structures of care. And I think that what we've got here is you're talking very strongly about the jobs in the system are not set up to support part-time roles. And that's, again, something that we're seeing with our customers. And I think for me, this possibly goes back to your observation that the welfare state and public policy is still essentially based around 1950s notions. And I think in this sense, it's probably still very strongly based around notions of 1950s nuclear families and primary caregivers. And the sort of on the ground practical ramifications of that we see of that in our customers is that there are particular pockets of poverty amongst single parent households. The main reason for that is that they can't actually afford the childcare that would enable them to go out to get a job. But also you see it in the universal credit welfare policies. So there's a very big disincentive to come off universal credit because the instability of work means that they might end up earning less than they would through universal credit. And then there's a very big barrier then to re-enter the system. So I think there needs to be some form of far more fundamental thinking around how care fits into people's lives and working lives in particular, and rethinking the family and how that can influence our models of social support. You also talked about imagining the new organisation. You talked about imagining an organisation that was locally rooted and community based, and reimagined as part of a whole life, with a focus on mutual support, interconnectedness, mutual learning and support, and a kind organisation. And I think here what you're talking about is a theme of not passive consumers, but reciprocal and demographic organisations, more of equal, where people are able to shape that organisation. And again, I think here you see a parallel with housing organisations. So I think housing organisations were sort of embryonic, and you've got the Roundtrees that I guess would parallel the Kellogg's that had was seeking to be a kind organisation at their heart, but I think that they lost something along the way and it's becoming overly paternalistic. And so from that, I think that you lost the sort of democratic and reciprocal elements. And I think more recently, the sector has started to look at being more strongly customer and tenant led, but arguably, as I think Grenfell has shown us, not quickly enough. And we've got a very strong way to move in that respect in housing organisations, as we do in organisations in their own right. But here I think we've got a bit of a tension. So you talk very interestingly about unions, and I think that's something that I can see very strongly in my work at Carbon Homes. So one of the things that we have struggled with is how you balance the sort of whole and fulfilling life and needs of our customers with the whole and fulfilling life and needs of our colleagues. And in particular, when we're talking about things like changing shift patterns, as British Gas were, but also actually through the COVID pandemic, when we were trying to make decisions around when is it right and fair for our customers to be able to, and kind, for us to be able to provide a vital service to our customers within our home, versus the tensions of is it right or fair and kind for us to ask our colleagues to enter customers in their home. And we were struggling with that through the whole of the pandemic. And here I think you're right in saying that there's an opportunity that I don't think has always been taken up by unions to support employers to have that broader dialogue that is looking at the relationship between the workers and colleagues and the customers and consumers, bearing in mind that here you're talking about an organisation or a set of organisations whose role it is to help people lead better lives rather than to make money for shareholders. I think my final comments were, I think that there were sort of 4 questions or themes that I was sort of interested in sort of exploring more or hearing more from you about. The first is that, as I've said, there was very strong parallels here for me between what you've said about, Hilary, about the good working life and what we're looking at in terms of sort of good house, what makes a home, same concepts coming out. But I'm always struck whenever I hear someone talk about employment and their experiences, that actually in the policy world, you've got 2 totally distinct strands there. So what can we do to try and bring those together? Because I think actually what we really need is a conversation, not actually about what makes a good work or a good organisation, but actually what I think is what makes a good life. And I think we need a collective reimagining of a good life and work as part of that, but also home and housing as part of that, and social life as part of that, etc. My second thought or theme was around, I think what you've done is brilliant, it's fascinating, it sounds so rich, but I think it's a luxury for many organisations or policymakers to be able to do something that intensive. So how do we sort of learn from or borrow from this approach and make it more scalable, so that the sorts of questions that you're asking and the answers and engagement that you're getting are more accessible to other charities and organisations and businesses? The third question that I had was around influence. So I think that, one of the reasons that foundational economy fascinates me is it's always really interesting to see and reflect on the differences between the political situation in Wales and that in England and the wider UK. So in Wales, you've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act at your heart. So it's easier, I think, to be talking to policymakers about a narrative of a whole life, protecting everyone's interests, thinking about impact on future sustainability, etc. In the UK and England, we don't have that background. So you've got the rhetoric of levelling up and left behind places, but simultaneous to that, you still have, Carol's asked this question, you've still got policymakers who are focusing on counting jobs. Personally, I wouldn't want us to stop counting jobs, but you need to do more than that. And I think it's how do we get the policymakers from from backing up the rhetoric about dealing with left behind places and levelling up, with actually making decisions to, for instance, extend the £20 uplift in universal credit, or not seek to pay for it for social care system through national insurance contributions, which are going to penalise the worst off. To me, there's still a massive gulf there. So how do we bring the messages and the lessons and the learnings that you're talking about, Hilary, and try and really influence the policymakers who are currently unreceptive, but are also the policymakers who are currently, and I think likely to be for a good while yet, in charge and continuing to make the decisions that ultimately influence what happens on the ground. So thank you, that's my thoughts and questions.
Thanks, Charlotte. Hilary, do you have any comments you'd like to come back on, or you want to wait for Chris?
Well, I mean, I've got so much to say. I loved what Charlotte said, and but I've also got my eye on the clock. I just wanted to say one factual thing though, which is that people didn't find it hard to imagine beyond their current reality. I'm sorry if I gave that impression. In fact, I think partly because of the design dynamics I've developed, people found it very easy, and the richness of people's imagination and how far they could go was absolutely incredible. The only group where it didn't work was NHS workers. And I think, I mean, all my family work with the NHS. I'm not saying that NHS workers are not imaginative, but I think I was working with a particular grade of worker who all knew each other, and they got very stuck. And usually people who've come to the tables, that's why I do the first exercise, they don't know each other when they sit down together. But I just wanted, that's just very important to me, is that actually my work is completely the opposite. By using these very visual methods, people's imagination has been off the scale actually. But the rest, well, I just want to talk to Charlotte about what she said. It's so interesting, but I'll pause and
Okay. Thanks, Hilary. There was so much there, wasn't it? But we do have to keep an eye on the clock. So, Chris, do you want to say a few words?
Yes, thank you, Ian. First challenge is, can anybody hear me after the problems I had before? Good. I had a settings problem, I think. Thank you very much. First of all, just to introduce myself, I'm Chris Johns. I'm the Chief Executive of the Building Communities Trust. We are an organisation that supports place-based work across Wales. We're a funder and a facilitator and an advocate. We have in-depth programmes in 13 specific communities in Wales, and we support a wider range of community practice as well. And we've been doing place-based work for about the last 6 years now. And in a sense, and I'll have a lot to say which is similar to Charlotte, and some things to say which are different, to slightly different types of organisation. But in a sense, one of our chief aims is to help people make their communities better places to live. And in a sense, we have no wider agenda than that, which means people can start with a blank piece of paper to a certain extent. And certainly at the core of this is a belief that people have the ability to make those decisions for themselves and make their communities better places. And to the extent that they do that with others from outside or do it on their own is entirely up to them. And a lot of those places are places that I think will probably sound very familiar to other people on the panel. Many of them are rather isolated housing estates. They're peripheral parts of cities. One or two are inner city and town areas. But they're places with relatively low levels of economic activity and low levels of income, relatively low levels of voter participation. The kind of areas where Hilary's research, at least in part maps pretty strongly, I imagine. And like Charlotte, I certainly found a lot of what was said resonating very strongly with me. One of the things that we found, which really does link in, is this desire to create and control local institutions. One of the most fundamental points that comes back from the work we do is this sense that people want institutions that are accountable to them, that they are responsible for its success, It can't be withdrawn at the whim of somebody from outside. And I think the whole discussion of local institutions, and there's a lot of terminology about anchor organisations at the moment kicking around, is a really interesting one. And certainly for those of us based in community work, it's rather galling to see housing associations and local authorities claim to be anchor organisations when they feel to many people in communities rather distant. And I think there's an interesting challenge in particular for housing associations, actually, because the practice of the best is really, really good and actually is very empowering and very accountable locally. But many are not in that space and manage to use the practice of the best as a way of riding that horse. And I think we, particularly in Wales, where there is a strong push by many housing organisations to call themselves mutuals, it's important, I think, that we understand what best practice is in that field and promote it, and hold a level of accountability in that area. And certainly also to recognise that at the moment, regardless of the rhetoric and expectation, that there is a distance between local communities and local authorities. And again, there are attempts in some areas to bridge that gap, and I think there are definitely improvements. I think there is still a long way to go in many areas, and we end up with quite a gulf at the moment between a phrase I don't normally like using, which is participatory democracy, because I think there is a difference between activism and participatory democracy, and elected representatives. And I think at the moment, to a large extent, the latter feel very, very distant to people in communities we work in, because they are taking decisions based, as has already been said by the previous two speakers, fundamentally on a paradigm that doesn't make much sense for the kind of economy we're talking about and trying to create. Just to give one quite horrible example of that we encountered a couple of years ago before the pandemic. A local authority employment team coming in quite hard into one of our communities, and essentially with the ambition of getting as many people off universal credit into Amazon over Christmas as possible, despite the fact that actually once you're into that stage of universal credit, getting back into where you were after you've lost your temporary job will almost certainly leave you worse off. But that wasn't actually a priority as long as they hit their short-term job targets. And I do think that one of the things that does run a really strong bell with me was Hilary's point about the nature of work. We did some research in some of the communities we're working about what makes good work, and there was a very strong consensus about the types of employer that people found valid, and actually wage rates were not the single most important thing. Flexibility, ability to cater for care needs came out really high. Ability to make your own decisions in work also came out really high. So people who worked in small organisations, be they community or private, actually reported higher levels of work satisfaction than those who worked in big organisations where their manager themselves was in the middle of a sausage factory chain and really had very little flexibility in how they dealt with them. Whereas in organisations where people felt they had a sense of agency, there was a much greater sense of satisfaction. And certainly if you added agency onto the flexibility you needed to be able to do the juggling that we've already talked about, then that, in a sense, offered the optimum almost regardless of wage levels. Now, obviously, the optimum is the optimum of what was practically possible at the time, not what people can imagine. Because I do agree from other exercises we've done that I don't think imagination is a problem, but achieving the reality of it is. I think one of the other aspects of work, though, in the communities we see is the degree to which many of probably a significant number of the jobs that people have accessible to them, both in spatial terms and educational attainment terms, are, if you like, the older jobs. So they're not jobs which are benefiting from the new technology. We saw very high levels of people in work having to go out to work during the pandemic. Working from home was not a viable option for many people. And we also see, for example, people being very, very vulnerable to things like high transport costs. And that's a challenge which the current nature of most of the jobs that people have is just not being answered at the moment. One of the responses to that, and this goes back to a point that Charlotte made, has been this growing emphasis, and I think one of the other panelists on here is Selwyn Williams, whose organisation's done a lot of work in this space, is to actually start redesigning the local economy and actually moving from this. One of the really interesting trends I've seen over the last 10 years or so is people at community level moving from what you might call social responses, things like play, older care, youth work, and so on, and trying to maximize the economic benefits out of them. What can we do locally? How can we turn this into a social enterprise? Or how can we partner with local private companies? And a local bit is important there, because a local private company is much more likely to be committed to the local area and have the institutional flexibility to work locally in a way a big company may well not do. So we've seen this growth in social enterprises taking on some of those responsibilities, which also links to the retreat of the state, of course, because some of those functions would previously have been local authority run. And there is, in many cases, a greater belief in their accessibility and appropriateness than there was in standardized local authority services. Of course, the potential loss of public services is of course their ability to reach everybody, and financial sustainability. And I need to recognise both of those challenges. And certainly there is a very set of interesting grey lines about where it's appropriate for communities to deliver services and where it's really important the state remains delivering services. And I don't think that we've had a sensible discussion about that at the moment. It tends to get lost in ideology about state versus market. But in fact, the experiences of people at community level would suggest a much more nuanced understanding of where the best places for that are.
Chris,
Sorry, Ian.
Can you wrap up?
Wrap up, yeah. Certainly. So I'll just to summarise. I think first of all, there, as I've already hinted, there is a real challenge around localism, about who's in a position to claim localism and what the degrees of accountability are. I think there is also a concern while I've fully recognised the transition point, I think for many people in the communities we work in, the immediate future, whatever people's ability to imagine, actually looks practically really challenging and potentially going to get worse rather than better. And how in practice we're going to move forward from that, I'm not sure. The other question I have, and this is probably for Hilary and for many other people, is actually the role of school-based education in preparing people for this kind of world and the extent to which it does or doesn't. And particularly in communities we work in, there is a real problem with the way that schools cater for older boys in particular, who often come out with a very low set of qualifications and very low self-esteem. And I suppose my biggest concern out of all of this is that we almost end up with a two-speed economy. We end up with, if you like, the Rishi Sunak, George Osborne economy for metropolitan centres, and we end up with a foundational economy focus in more economically peripheral areas. And while that might give us more agency, or more agency for the people in those areas, it will be so on very limited resources, and the power, if anything, will get even more concentrated in the metropolitan areas. And that's why we face a fundamental challenge in making this shift, because there are an awful lot of people with a lot to lose.
Thanks, Chris. That's a great point at the end. Very conscious we've got time, but Hilary, do you have anything you'd like to add or respond?
Well, I'm not quite sure, Ian, what to do. I've got so much. I don't know whether we'd like to take more questions. I mean, I think that final point that John made is so important. I mean, it's definitely already happening, and it's very, I mean, one of the things is that in my work, I'm working in places where I'm invited to work. So I live in Peckham in Southwark, Nobody here is interested in this at all. What they're interested in is knocking down as much social housing as possible and joining the George Osborne economy versus, you know, Grimsby, Barnsley, like all the places that are like, could you come and do, we're really interested in these ideas. Can you come and do your work here? And I think that's very complicated, because also what we also see in those economies are, you know, I don't want to be romantic about it, but we do see kind of very different. I mean, if I think about somewhere like East Ayrshire, we do see very different important qualities of life as well, that, for instance, I would like to nurture here in Peckham if I could find a way to transplant, because our lives here in Peckham would be a lot richer. So I think this is what you've just touched on is really important. I mean, just to kind of say about East Ayrshire, just because there's so much, I mean, I think that it is really important to situate this discussion in something much broader. I like the way that Charlotte talked about home, not housing, that John has talked about transport, about how all of these things are part of the discussion. It isn't a discussion, as I said, about jobs or work in that sense. But one of the things that's very interesting in the work in East Ayrshire, led by the local state under this banner of vibrant communities, is that their state workers are their community, of course. So they have begun to think in really different ways, starting with state workers, but moving out in ways that powerfully disrupt otherwise this kind of thing that you might get to, which Charlotte touched on, which is, you know, well, we've got to look after the workers, but the customers want this, and kind of having thought completely differently about how every worker is a community member and started a different dialogue. It's very exciting, I think, what's beginning to happen there. And this just touches on something in the chat that Carol has asked about, you know, if we had a different party, what would happen? I mean, of course, I have my own political affiliations, but I have no faith that any different change to any party will make any difference to any of this, because what we're talking about here this morning is just such a kind of completely different way of looking at the world from a completely different value system that both Charlotte and Chris have spoken very powerfully to. And that is about creating and controlling local institutions, and that is about power. It's about how they're funded, because you're always going to be some sort of, you know, passive participant, consumer of an organisation, unless you kind of control how it is funded and how it is owned. So I think that that's very important. But what I do think is interesting is, just to kind of finally make a comment rooted in my own actual work, this particular strand of work, is that local government have asked me to work in these places, and they have actually financially supported the work in very small ways, because my time is funded as a researcher. And the work is very, I mean, it's very cheap, it's very tiny, it's me with a rucksack and a pack of cards and my time. But I think it is really interesting that the local state is, who on one hand you could say have no responsibility for this at all, because it all sits at the centre, are really, really interested in grappling with a kind of new alliance between the economy, between, you know, in the best end, as Chris said, because it's not, it's very different, but at the best end, about thinking about, you know, what is a local institution, how is it controlled, and then what is the role of kind of work in the economy in that. And I do think that that is a place to get in, which also kind of, you know, sort of links to a question that John has asked in the chat, John Tomini, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, John, which is, you know, how do we begin to kind of, we don't want scale exactly, but we definitely want spread, and how do we begin to get spread? And I think that the local state is kind of a place where we can work and where that can happen. I could say much more, but I want there to be more questions, Ian, so I think I should not say more.
Yeah, thanks, Hilary. I think there are so many issues that have been brought up, and I know we've got 3 days to discuss them. And that's a testimony to the richness of your presentation, but we've only got Hilary till 11:30, so I think we need to try and move to questions now. So as I said, there's a reaction button on the bottom right of your screen, and you can click the raise hand there if you have any questions, or we can take questions in the chat. So we've got about 8 minutes left. So if anybody has a question, this is your chance to raise it. I've got Kevin Morgan first out of the blocks, and then Martin O'Neill. Kevin.
Thank you. And a quick question to Hilary. Hilary, if I understood you correctly, you said that party politics doesn't amount to very much and is pretty inconsequential If that's the case, what kind of alliances for change would be more consequential?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, having my words repeated back to me make me sort of blanch slightly, because of course I do actually think it matters who's going to be in power. But I mean, Carol and I, I first discussed this work with Carol in a Labour Party meeting, and I think that because the idea of sort of actual participatory democracy, as Chris has put it, the idea of kind of worker voice and imagination is quite alien to the left if it's kind of really flourishing rather than highly organised. But I suppose what I'm exploring now, and it's just an exploration, is to go back to those 4 groups that I see having played a role in previous revolutions and asking, where would the alliances come from? So I definitely think that there is a powerful role for those I call the new industrialists. So they are business leaders who are engaging at a different level because they realize that the form of capitalism in which they've kind of thrived so far is over. Now, sometimes they realize it's over for kind of good reasons, and sometimes they just realize that they won't have a business if they keep going. But I think that is an important strand, because that is a small but powerful group of people who understand that, there's no point exploiting workers to the bottom and so on. There's no point in kind of not thinking about your working place. So I think finding those people and making that alliance is really important. I think the organic intellectuals are really important. I mean, I really don't think we have enough stories about how things could be. And those stories are coming from communities, they're coming from academics, but they need to be stories that touch hearts and minds. They need to be kind of alive, so they have to be in there. I think we do need to find the state actors, and it does matter who they are. So they have to be in the alliance, but I think, unfortunately, if we just wait for them to make the change, it's not going to happen in time. And then fourthly, I think civil society is really important. And again, this is quite a complex discussion, because Chris talked about how housing associations and government kind of run the gamut. I mean, so do so-called community organisations. I mean, one thing I would like is to have an acknowledged difference between very large third sector organisations that are kind of mass industrial and largely paternalistic versus actual community organisations. And we don't even yet have the language or the classification, but that would be a really important start in terms of kind of thinking who we could bring into the new alliance. But I guess I'm looking for people that I will call the new horizontalists, that are kind of deep knowledge in their sector, whether they're an academic or a kind of member of the state, but really willing to kind of stretch out and build these horizontal bonds, because I think that's the only way forward.
Thanks, Hilary. I forgot to say, if you could say who you are and where you're from. Martin, your hand is up.
Yeah, hi, good morning. My name is Martin Kitchen. I work at the Business School at Cardiff University. I wondered what role you thought, Hilary, business schools might have in advancing your agenda.
Well, I think you are producing the industrialists of the future, and I think that I don't know anything about Cardiff Business School, so I would wish I was there and we could have a conversation and I could learn about it. But I mean, I think in most professions, and this goes again back to something Chris said, I mean, I could talk about schools for the next half hour. We can see that pedagogy and curriculums are really not suited for purpose. And I think that we can see, with young people who are desperate to explore kind of alternative spaces, whether it's kind of alternative forms of investment or community vehicles, many of which aren't really robust, but there's a lot of energy in trying to think about new forms of business, new forms of capitalism, where does that investment come from? And I think the question would be how business schools could kind of open up that thinking, and again create really strong national and international links with people who are doing it, because the practice is there, but it's quite hard to find, particularly if you're kind of young and starting out, I think. What do you think? I'd like to know what you think, Martin.
Well, I'm very glad you asked, because at Cardiff Business School we've thought about this quite carefully, and I think we're one of the first business schools to have thought about the purpose of business schools, and we've developed a strategy around the delivery of public value. And so maybe we could continue this conversation again. But there's a small but growing number of business schools that are thinking more along your lines and looking to incorporate that within their curricula. And I can share some information about that with you. So thank you.
Okay. we've basically got 3 minutes left. So first of all, I'd just like to apologise for dreadful chairing. I think we could carry on for another half hour at least, but we do have to bring it to a close. So can I ask Hilary, Chris and Charlotte just to come together and maybe very quickly go around the table, ending with Hilary, just to have their closing thoughts. So literally 1 minute each. Charlotte, do you have something to add at the end?
Thanks, I'll be quicker than that. I mean, what this has left with me is the need for us to, as Hilary said, forge new, particularly local place-based alliances so that we're able to collectively reimagine what a good life looks like and use that reimagining to influence fundamental changes in public policy.
Thanks, Charlotte. Chris?
I completely agree. Actually, my thoughts were very much that we need to focus on the practical. We need to focus on actually having clear examples that both work for the people in those localities and make a persuasive case elsewhere. And I think there is some evidence that we can build this up area by area. We won't get to everywhere, but we can expand the critical mass of work that's going on.
Well, I very much agree with what both Charlotte and Chris said. And I suppose in my closing remarks, I'd like to kind of come back to a question that Charlotte asked me about, you know, it's what my work, why, how does it align with the foundational economy? And I suppose that the kind of pre-alignment was that I use methods which are intentional in the fact that they kind of are very open and they're very participatory. So that suggests that already I think everything should be built ground up, although I think, you know, obviously we can sort of complexify that a bit. But I think what's really important and hopeful about the work I've been doing is that people come open to these workshops with no pre-prescribed agenda, and if you like, they do describe the foundational economy. And just to kind of touch very concretely, I mean, the idea about the 4-day week, which, as I say, wasn't on a card, nobody could say that I pre-suggested that. It was not possible to, you had to kind of, all of that stuff about time people came up with. And some of those workshops took place at a time when Jeremy Corbyn was suggesting and being very, very mocked for the idea of a 4-day week, that nobody would be interested in this. And yet, you know, the gravediggers in Kilmarnock were telling me that they were interested in that, but way, way beyond that in their kind of imaginings of how things should be. So I suppose what I think is really important is that there is this, you know, if we can get out of adversarial conversations, which again is about the kind of horizontal bonds, and get together in new ways, there is a kind of massive hunger for this work. It's not niche, it's kind of out there. And I mean, I suppose all of us here today know it's not niche, but we need to kind of really believe that and think about how we can kind of harness that power that many people, they don't know about the foundation economy, they're not going to use those terms, but they're kind of doing that work and dreaming of that work. And I think that that's what's really important.
Okay, thank you so much. Can I say thanks to Charlotte and Chris first of all for volunteering to be Discussants today and for raising such interesting points, but also to thank everyone who's involved, and last but not least to thank Hilary. If you're interested in some of these ideas, I highly recommend this book. That it talks about the methods of social design, but also gives some really interesting case studies. So it's rooted in concrete examples. So it's a really good read. So please go out and buy it. I really enjoyed reading it. And so thank you very much to Hilary. I hope we can have you back at some point to discuss these issues at more length and at face-to-face.
I'd love that. I'm so honoured that you had me with you this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now to everyone, we start again at 2 o'clock. Julie Froud will be chairing, hopefully doing a better job than me. And we're going to look at some examples of researching a good life. So I hope to see you all again at 2 o'clock. Take care, everyone.